Biological Realist, a podcast dedicated to exploring the impact of evolution on human mind and society. And before getting to today's show, I'd like to take a few moments to encourage you to support the podcast. There's a few ways you can do this. One is to simply buy any Amazon product through the widgets that you see there on the site. Particularly, I'll draw your attention to that little bar that pops up from the bottom of the screen. So any book that you hear discussed on the show that you'd like to buy, or any other book, or any other product that you'd like to buy on Amazon, by buying it through that link, you can, at no extra cost to yourself, you pay the same thing as whether you bought it there or went directly to Amazon, but you create commissions for the show that allows us to keep it on the air. So that would be really helpful if you could do that. The other thing is that, of course, there's opportunities to make donations to the show. We have several options there. You should be able to see a PayPal donation button and Bitcoin for those who use Bitcoin, and coming soon we'll also have a Patreon campaign. So lots of options to be able to make donations. So any of these things that you can do to help us generate the revenues we need to keep the show on the air would be much appreciated. So that's it for now, and let's get to today's episode. Hello, I'm Michael McConkey, host of the Biological Realist podcast. And today, I'm joined by Athena Actipus, Assistant Professor of Psychology at Arizona State University. Hello, Athena. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great. So we're going to talk today about your work in cooperation theory and particular principles that you've identified working at different levels, levels of biological entities, I suppose. But I thought before we get into that, maybe you could tell the listeners a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I am a psychologist by training, but my work really spans from evolutionary biology to anthropology to computer science. I use computational modeling to look at what conditions make cooperation more viable, how cooperation is maintained, and how it evolves in the first place.
Okay, that's great. So let's look at these principles that you've identified, and there's 3 of them. And let's see if I get my notes here. So if I have it right, so Walkaway, which I guess is what economists call exit, sharing, and cheater detection and punishment. Is that correct?
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways that you can parse it. So I would say Walkaway is one general principle that works across systems to help support cooperation. The other is having some sort of systems for detecting cheating in order to sort of suppress conflict. But then you also have a simple principle of transferring resources based on need, and that's something that that we've seen in a lot of different systems. So looking at human sharing all the way to sort of the origins of life and multicellularity, and then also in cancer and how cancer is sort of a reflection of cheating in the body.
Okay, so how about we just go through each of these, and you can just give us a quick summary of how these work. In whichever way you want. I mean, the focus of the show is on social, on social evolution, human social evolution. But I mean, I understand part of what's unique about the work you're doing is sort of the cross level connections between things. So however you want to do it. So what is Walkaway? What do you mean by that?
Right. Well, Walkaway is exactly what it sounds like. So, and I can give a little bit of background on why I got interested in the Walkaway strategy. So, if you look at the work that's been done on the evolution of cooperation, sort of historically speaking, Axelrod's work on the prisoner's dilemma, looking at different strategies and seeing what's successful, that was all done in the context of a world where strategies are sort of pairing up randomly, and the length of time that they interact is random. And so the only options that the agents had, that the strategies had, were to cooperate or to defect, where defecting is basically non-cooperating or retaliating, or there are any number of ways that you can think about it, but those are really the only two options. And when I started getting interested in the evolution of cooperation, so this was when I was in college, my first year, I just really got interested in the evolution of cooperation and wanted to start doing some modeling of this myself. So I started, learning programming, and I very quickly realized, hey, if the only two options are cooperating or exploiting, basically, you lose out on a hugely important aspect of not only human behavior, but the behavior of pretty much, most of the free living organisms that we have in the world, which is they usually have the ability to decide if they're going to continue to interact or not. And that might be because they can physically leave, or because they can otherwise, cut off connections. But that the models that had been done for the evolution of cooperation really didn't take that ability to leave into account. And so I put together just a very, very simple model where individuals played a prisoner's dilemma game, and they did it in a space. There was a two-dimensional space, so sort of a grid. And if two individuals landed on the same spot, then they would have they play a game according to the prisoner's dilemma payoffs. And basically, the prisoner's dilemma is a social dilemma where the best thing from the perspective of the dyad would be for both to cooperate. But each of them as individuals would get a higher payoff if they exploit and the other cooperates. But if they both exploit, then they both don't do well. So there's a real tension there between, choosing to cooperate or exploit. So anyway, back to the model. So you have these individuals, they're moving around in space, and they can either cooperate or exploit. But I added another thing, which is that individuals could decide to stay on a patch or leave. And if they stayed on that patch and their partner also stayed, then they would have opportunity to interact again in the next time period. But if one of them left or both of them left, then that set of interactions would end. And so then I ran the model with agents that played the sort of tit-for-tat strategy, which is what Axelrod and Hamilton found to be the most successful. This is the, if you cooperate, or if your partner cooperates, then you cooperate on the next round. And if your partner defects, then you defect on the next round. And, that was what they had found did best in, most of the simulations that they ran. So this, tit-for-tat idea has really been kind of dominant. So I wanted to have the walkaway strategy play in a world where agents could play tit-for-tat too. So so I ran it with agents that played tit-for-tat, with agents that played walkaway, which is basically you always cooperate and you just leave if your partner defects. And I also included walkaway agents that were exploiters, so they never ever cooperated, but they also only would stay with partners who cooperate. So, you could think of those as con artists or something. They're just looking for individuals to exploit. And I put a couple other strategies in there too. And basically what I found was that under most of the parameter space, the walkaway strategy completely dominated all the other strategies, and that even tit-for-tat couldn't outperform walkaway. And even more than that, the thing that really struck me was if I started with a population that had almost all defectors, so 100 agents in there, for example, and then had only a few cooperators either playing tit-for-tat or playing walkaway, that it took about 30% of the population to be tit-for-tat, for tit-for-tat to be able to take over from a population of defectors. But for walkaway, it only took a couple. Most of the time with, about 10% walkaway agents, walkaway was able to take over a population of defectors. So, so to me this was interesting on a couple different levels. So one is just, thinking about cooperation in humans and in other, large organisms, that Walkaway is really a very, very simple rule that most free living organisms could use, and it doesn't require punishment, it doesn't require memory or anything. All you have to do is respond to, what happened in the last time period and leave if your partner is not cooperating. So that suggests you don't really necessarily need complex cognition for cooperation to be viable if individuals are just, conditionally staying or leaving, depending on the behavior of their partners. And it also suggests that, when we think about, how did cooperation initially evolve, whether, we're talking about, sequences of DNA that started to replicate together, or we're talking about the, origins of multicellularity. So how did cells start, sort of sticking together and, reproducing as a unit rather than as individual cells? I think that Walkaway helps to kind of frame the question a little bit differently, so can consider the realities of how individual decisions, we're talking about, multicellular organisms or cells, how those individual cells and their sort of, decisions about whether to stay attached to a nearby cell or break off, how those may have really been shaped by cooperative processes going on in those very early cell clusters.
That's a lot to digest. So first on just going back a step to the prisoner dilemma thing, because I was kind of shocked when I read this in your paper that no one's thought of this. I mean, I understand prisoner dilemma problem is the method's been developed to solve certain kinds of problems, to find answers to certain kind of questions, but it seems bizarre if no one has ever considered an exit strategy, because it just seems like, so that's what it's what we do, right? If you don't like dealing with people, you don't deal with them anymore. So it's kind of astounding that it has never really been considered before. So so that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Now,
there has been some work on sort of looking at ending interactions, but putting it actually in a spatial context, that had never been done before.
Right, right. So so now you were talking about one of the advantages of this, of using this strategy, is that it simplifies the cognitive mechanisms necessary to get cooperation going. And I think that's also, I mean, part of what I think we're going to end up talking about here is how this model you're sketching out differs from the sort of the Robert Trivers version of reciprocal altruism, which I think a lot of people think of when they think of how how you get cooperation going among non-kin.
Right.
So I guess part of that is the sort of the rules of sharing too. Maybe you want to talk about those, and we can maybe fill those in a little bit.
Yeah, great. So a big part of my work is looking at cooperation in human sharing. So that's part of the Human Generosity Project that I'm co-director of, and we look at when do people share, especially when do they transfer resources without expecting a return. So this is sort of looking for instances of cooperation or sharing that don't really fit the sort of tit-for-tat model. And our focus has really been looking at the project started looking at the sharing rules that the Maasai of East Africa use. So they have a sharing system that they call Osotwa. And Osotwa is based on sort of two main rules for sharing. One is that you ask only if you're in need, and the other is that if you're asked by an Osotwa partner, then you give as long as you're able to without going below your own threshold for what's needed for you to be viable. So it's a sort of limited risk pooling system, or a kind of social insurance system, where individuals are able to get help when they're in need by having these Osotwa partners. And in the other societies that we're looking at as part of the Human Generosity Project, we see similar systems that are based on these same two ideas of you ask only if you're in need, and you give if you're asked and able. They vary a little bit. So sometimes, like with au sautoir, it's based on pairwise relationships. So individuals will be au sautoir partners. But for example, in Fiji, they have a system called carry, and that is a sort of system that's based on group membership. So everyone who's part of the village is part of that carry network. So it's not based on dyadic relationships as it is with au sautoir. And we see this in Western societies too. In fact, one of our field sites is here in Arizona and New Mexico among ranchers, so sort of real life cowboys. And they have systems that are very similar. They sort of call them neighboring, where they help each other if someone's injured or needs help.
Okay, so this is interesting. The because I don't know if you know much about Marx, Karl Marx, but I mean Karl Marx got criticized a lot for his simplistic, and and he didn't have a lot of the evidence that we have, a characterization of primitive societies as being sort of primitive communism. But actually, the way you're describing it, I mean, what's resonating in my mind is that famous slogan from the Communist Manifesto: "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need." I mean, that sounds like that's what you're describing. You think that's accurate?
Not quite, because what you get with a need-based transfer system, at least the way the Maasai have it, is limited pooling, and it's not necessarily pooling of resources, but it's partial limited pooling of risk. So let me explain the difference between resource pooling and risk pooling. So in a resource pooling system, individuals will sort of take all of the resources and put it into some common pot and then split it using some rules, usually, equal. In a risk pooling system, individuals will sort of hang on to all of their own resources usually, except that they may then help another if another encounters risk. And so they're sort of pooling that risk without necessarily sharing all the resources. And the way, at least it works with the Maasai, is that individuals may vary a lot actually in the size of the herds they have and how many cattle they have. That's their main resource. And the individuals who are most rich aren't necessarily going to be the ones who give if someone asks. It's all based on the sort of dyadic relationships that they have. And one is always there's always a sort of floor on how much you would give based on what you need to survive. So there's the need-based transfer system actually tolerates wealth inequality in a way that a resource pooling system wouldn't. But all that being said, when we ran models with an account keeping system and a need-based transfer system, we did find that there was more equality with a need-based transfer system and more inequality with the account keeping system if you're just comparing those two. But an account keeping system gives more equality than having no transfers at all. So you get some advantage from the account keeping in terms of reducing inequality as well, if that's your goal.
Okay, that's great. That's clarified. Thanks. So, and I think you do talk about in your work that there's issues around the threshold point. I mean, what we're talking at the point that you made clear there is that this is not like a constant equalization, but it's like an insurance policy that clicks in when a certain level of risk comes in. And you talk about, I think, the fact that there's issues to be settled around the threshold at which these processes of sharing kick in. And I guess that's like in different social contexts. Is this what we're saying, that in different societies there's different thresholds?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Sort of what do we all agree is sort of the threshold of what constitutes need? And, it really is an ethical question. And the only thing that we can really say about it from our research so far is that in order to sort of make a model of it, you have to just arbitrarily, or maybe not so arbitrarily, decide that there's some threshold of need. But if that were to vary, then that would potentially really change the outcomes of the models, because we've always had it be the same for all individuals. And if we look across the societies that we're studying, it does seem like they have sort of different notions of what constitutes need. So hunter-gatherers who, go foraging every day and bring back really just what they need for that day, their idea of what they need is very different from pastoralists like the Maasai, who have herds of cattle, and they survive on the milk and the blood and the meat from those animals. They're sort of working on a different kind of time scale, and they're accumulating more capital, and that means that their notion of what constitutes need is pretty different from how a hunter-gatherer might constitute need, and which are both probably very different from what a Western individual living in a large-scale society might think of as their threshold of need.
Okay, because so this is interesting, because originally I was thinking that what distinguishes your needs-based sharing model from a sort of Trivers reciprocal altruism type model was that there was less need for, and I think you actually talk about this, less need for sort of refined account keeping, like who owes what to whom, who have I lent a slab of beef and owes me one somewhere down the road, and this kind of thing. But it does seem, though, that there has to be some kind of accounts keeping in this model that you're describing still, because, I mean, if you could imagine, the free rider could sort of like, well, when I need help from others, the threshold is at this point, but, when others need help from me, the threshold is, much higher, right? So you could game the system that way. And I understand there's got to be, there can be social norms to regulate these things, but even the social norms in themselves have to be monitored by people if we're going to avoid that kind of free riding on the system. So was I mistaken to think that there's less account keeping involved?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to how we're defining various terms. So I think there's a difference between, say, account keeping type of reciprocity that requires balanced accounts versus just like, say, a cheater detection system that's looking for violations of various rules. When it comes to sort of the standard account keeping model of reciprocity, what constitutes cheating is if you take a benefit without paying a cost. That's sort of your standard, cheating in that account keeping system. While in a need-based transfer system, cheating is a little bit different. So cheating would be asking for help if you're not really in need, or not giving if someone asks you and you're able. So the rules of the systems are different, and so cheating, violation of those rules, is going to be different. And so, it is true that a need-based transfer system can be vulnerable to cheating, but the cheating is of a different kind than in an account-keeping system.
And something else I wanted to ask you about, because I always come to these kind of questions through the lens of the selfish gene, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, like, have you thought about, or how would factor into your analysis the prospect that individuals who more often are the ones who are providing aid to others gain some kind of personal fitness advantage in that, in terms of achieving prestige in the society? Is that something that you found?
So it's certainly something that we're looking at in the anthropological fieldwork. But the bigger question of sort of, what is the fitness advantage to being part of a need-based transfer system? I think that really, if one switches from considering just the sort of expected value, right? So sort of Trivers-style reciprocal altruism idea is focused on notion that you can, in the end, get a higher payoff, right, from having some transfer of resources back and forth. But evolution doesn't just look at expected value, it also looks at the variance, basically. So if you can do things that avoid the likelihood of a catastrophic loss, that's also something that can be very beneficial. So individuals may have, the benefits from engaging in these need-based transfer relationships because it reduces the variance. It basically makes it less likely that you'll, die or have a very, very poor outcome. So that's sort of one part of the answer to the question. But, if we look across societies, for example, the work in Fiji suggests that individuals who are generous do have higher status or get status from that giving. So being chiefly in Fiji is associated with being more generous, and it appears that confers, that act of generosity confers status on them. But that's something that we're sort of looking at in an ongoing way. One of the anthropologists on the team, Matt Gervais, he is going back and forth from the field looking at those kinds of questions.
Is there any evidence that increased status results in improved reproductive success?
I don't think that has been looked at so specifically yet. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you then about a general question in relationship to cooperation theory. And this is not, and I'm not saying that you do this. In fact, you don't do this. But I do find sometimes when I read some evolutionary work around cooperation that there's a tendency to, in some circles, to put a lot of positive spin on cooperation. And I understand why this is. I mean, human cooperation is a pretty remarkable thing, as we've been talking about, in terms of the scale of human cooperation and the fact that it doesn't have a kin-based foundation. I mean, maybe at the beginning, at the base it does, but I mean, it's expanded far beyond that. So it is a pretty remarkable thing. But I do find that there's often this emphasis upon the idea that conflict is bad and cooperation is good. And of course, cooperation produces lots of great things through division of labor and specialization and comparative advantage and economies of scale and so forth. Mm-hmm. But I do sometimes think that in some of these discussions, we end up losing sight of the fact that cooperation can be done for reasons that aren't entirely admirable, or to achieve ends that aren't entirely admirable. And this is something I've been really influenced by the work of Richard Alexander in thinking about this, in the way that all cooperation on some level is about competition, and even within cooperative units there's often competition over control over that particular unit or alliance and this sort of thing. So I'm very much aware of how the two are always competition or / conflict and cooperation are sort of nested into each other. But there's even instances, and before we came on the air, I in a note I sent you, brought up the example, and it's always, people always cringe now when you bring up the Nazis as an example, but I'm going to bring it up. I mean, immense achievement of cooperation to bring about the Holocaust. I mean, mass genocide while fighting a major world war. I mean, extraordinary achievement of cooperation, but very few of us would think it's a good thing. So in that context, conflict and competition, and those who are trying to undermine that cooperation maybe are the on the side of the angels kind of thing. So there's a series of rambling thoughts, all leading me towards asking you if you think that in cooperation theory or in evolutionary theory in general, when people are looking at cooperation, do you think that enough consideration is given to the fact that cooperation isn't always a good thing, and that maybe we have to think about that issue in a more complex or nuanced way? That's a pretty broad question, so you can answer it in whichever way you find appropriate.
Yeah, well, I think you're right that for whatever reason, when we think about cooperation and conflict, there's almost a kind of black and white thinking about it often, which clearly there's a more sort of nuanced way to approach it. And one of the ways that I kind of like to think about these issues is that when we're talking about cooperation or we're talking about conflict, we always have to think of sort of relative to what. So one can think of how evolution operates on systems by sort of considering that there's sort of a light side to evolution and a dark side. So I'll use a Star Wars metaphor here. And the light side is sort of the selection pressures that lead to greater cooperation, more organization, larger entities that can coordinate their behavior. And then there's a dark side, which is the evolutionary processes sort of within that can undermine that organization, that can exploit it, that can make it less viable and less long-lasting. But for any given system, if we're going to talk about what's the light side and what's the dark side of evolution, we have to talk about, well, what is the sort of target system that we're looking at? So, if we're looking at, a multicellular body, and we look at the light side of evolution, that's, the evolution of greater body size. And the dark side of evolution is, cancer evolving in the body that's sort of exploiting the tissues. But we can then go to a different level, right? And if you say, well, what happens if cancer cells actually start cooperating with each other and sharing resources and coordinating their behavior so they can invade better? Then that's, cooperation that's going on at a level that is below the level of the organism, that's undermining the viability of that organism. And, I think that your question about, these situations in history where, atrocities have been committed, and that's been, partially the result of individuals cooperating and coordinating, that there's potentially a parallel there where you have a process that, has aspects to it that are clearly cooperative and coordinating, but they're undermining cooperation on an even higher level, a sort of, social level, where there's, sort of norms and rules about how individuals will operate vis-a-vis each other, and those are being undermined by, organization, a system from the inside.
Yeah, I mean, it's like and it scales down, right? Because I mean, from the view of the world of nations, that Hitler and the Nazis might have been thought of as a cancer, but they looked upon the French underground as a cancer, sort of like cooperating to undermine their cooperation, right?
Right.
Yeah, so we've got all these scaled things. So anyways, I guess just the thing that interests me about this is the complexity of it, the way in which the cooperation and competition are nested within each other, and how we have to look at this at a more complex level to be able to get a fuller picture of what's really going on, whether we're talking about evolution or talking about human society.
Sure.
Well, we're running on time here because I know you have to run, and I really appreciate it. And I should tell the listeners we had a very hard time trying to do this morning. I had all kinds of trouble, but we're back. So I really appreciate you, Athena, being so flexible on this.
My pleasure.
So maybe to wrap up, then maybe I'll just give you a final question. So again, another sort of open-ended question. I mean, what is it then in your research, if you could sort of distill your research up, and I know it's an ongoing project, but if you could distill what you've done up to this point into one last message that you'd like the wider public to be aware of, what would that be?
Well, I guess it would be something like that selfishness is not necessarily the default state. I think a lot of work in evolutionary biology, cooperation theory has kind of come at it from that assumption, but the fact is that really only holds when you make specific assumptions about the environment that the individuals are evolving in particular, having random interactions and not having the ability to, move conditionally, not having the ability to kind of decide on the partners that you're going to have. So, as soon as you go to a world where you can have preferential interactions with partners, the default state sort of changes. So it's not that defection and selfishness will always, win out. When cooperators can preferentially interact with each other, then cooperation becomes much more viable, and it may even make sense to think about cooperation as the default state in those kinds of conditions.
My guest today has been Athena Activist. Athena, thanks very much for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
So that's today's show. Thanks for listening. The Biological Realist podcast is available on YouTube, but we'd encourage you to come to our homepage. That's Michael McConkey, Michael, McConkey, McConkey.com/The Biological Realist podcast. If you come there, you can find a full inventory of all the shows that we've done and show pages that give you more information on the various guests. Plus, you have the opportunity to support the show by either making donations or buying products through Amazon that, at no extra cost to yourself, can generate commissions that help us keep the show on the air. So, thanks very much for listening, and watch out for us next time. We look forward to see you in the next episode of The Biological